Every empire that ever called itself invincible eventually marched on to the Iranian plateau and discovered, in the most painful way imaginable, that conquering land and conquering a civilization are two entirely different things. For 5,000 years, the pattern repeated with almost eerie precision. A foreign army would pour through the mountain passes, burn the palaces, slaughter the defenders, and plant its flag in the smoking ruins of yet another Persian capital. And for 5,000 years, the result was always the same. Not the death of Iran, but the slow, quiet transformation of the conqueror into something unmistakably Iranian. This is not a story about military triumph. This is the story of the most successful cultural survival operation in the entire history of the human species. The Macedonian phalanxes of Alexander the Great came first among the famous destroyers. In 330 BCE, Alexander's soldiers torched Persepolis, the ceremonial jewel of the Achaemenid Empire, a complex so vast that its audience hall alone could hold 10,000 people. The cedar roof beams, shipped from Lebanon at staggering expense, fed a fire visible for miles across the plain of Mavdasht. Alexander believed he was erasing an empire. Instead, within a single generation of his death, his own successors, the Seleucids, who inherited the eastern portion of his fractured domain, were minting coins with Persian titles, employing Persian administrators, marrying into Persian aristocratic families, and governing through the very bureaucratic machinery Alexander had supposedly destroyed. The Greek language sat like a thin layer of frost on the surface. Beneath it, the deep cultural topsoil remained stubbornly, irreversibly Persian. Then came the Romans, whose legions defined the Western concept of military invincibility. Rome fought Persia, first the Parthian dynasty, then the Sassanids for nearly 700 consecutive years, making it the longest sustained rivalry between two empires in recorded history. 7 centuries of warfare, and not once did Rome manage to hold Iranian territory for more than a few seasons. The Emperor Valerian learned this the hardest way possible in 260 CE, when he was captured alive by the Sassanid king Shapur I, becoming the only Roman emperor in history to suffer that particular humiliation. Persian rock reliefs at Nakhche-Rostam immortalize the scene to this day, the mighty Caesar kneeling before the Persian King of Kings. Rome could conquer Gaul, Britain, Egypt, and Judea, but Persia remained a wall that would not break. The Arab conquest of the 7th century appeared at first glance to succeed where Alexander and Rome had failed. The Sassanid Empire, exhausted by decades of war against Byzantium, collapsed with shocking speed after the Battle of Al-Qadisiyah in 636 CE. Arab armies swept across the plateau, and Islam replaced Zoroastrianism as the dominant faith within 2 centuries. Surely this was the end of Persian civilization? Not remotely.
Within 150 years of the conquest, Persian scholars, poets, and administrators had become the intellectual backbone of the Abbasid Caliphate. The city of Baghdad itself was designed and built largely by Persian engineers. The legendary Barmakid family, originally Buddhist administrators from Balkh in Greater Khorasan, rose to become the most powerful viziers in the Islamic world. The Persian language didn't die, it reinvented itself, adopted the Arabic script, absorbed thousands of Arabic loanwords, and emerged as the lingua franca of high culture from Anatolia to Bengal. Once again, the conquered had swallowed the conqueror from the inside. And then arrived the most terrifying force the medieval world had ever witnessed: the Mongol hordes of Genghis Khan. Between 1219 and 1258, Mongol invasions killed an estimated percentage of Iran's population so staggering that some historians place it between 30 and 50%. Cities that had been centers of learning for centuries, Nishapur, Merv, Balkh, Herat, were reduced to silent fields of rubble and bone. In Nishapur alone, chroniclers recorded that the Mongols stacked severed heads into pyramids sorted by men, women, and children. They even killed the cats and dogs so that no living thing remained. The irrigation systems that had sustained agriculture for millennia were deliberately destroyed, turning fertile land into desert that is not fully recovered to this day, 800 years later. Any other civilization on Earth would have been extinguished permanently. The Babylonians vanished, the Hittites vanished, the Assyrians survive only as a scattered diaspora. But Persia? Within 80 years, the Mongol Ilkhanate ruling Iran had converted to Islam, adopted the Persian language for its court documents, commissioned Persian miniature paintings, and built monuments in the Persian architectural style. Genghis Khan's great-grandson, Ghazan Khan, even took a Persian title. The pattern held. The conqueror dissolved. Persia endured. So, the question that burns at the heart of this entire narrative is deceptively simple, yet maddeningly difficult to answer. How? How has Iran managed, from deep antiquity right up to the present day, to force every major world power, Greek, Roman, Arab, Mongol, Turkish, British, American, to reckon with it on its own terms? How did this nation preserve an unbroken thread of cultural identity across 50 centuries through catastrophe after catastrophe that would have annihilated any other people? And how did it happen that Great Persia, a country whose very name once evoked golden palaces and immortal armies, voluntarily abandoned that legendary title in 1935, demanding that the entire international community call it by the name its own people had always used: Iran, the land of the Aryans? This is not merely the story of one country.
This is the story of a civilization that invented the very concept of cosmic time that still shapes how billions of people understand the universe. The idea of linear history moving from creation toward a final judgment. It is the story of a people who turned geopolitics into a holy war between light and darkness, a framework so powerful that it echoes in every modern conflict where one side calls the other evil. And it is the story of a nation that learned through millennia of brutal experience how to lose battles, lose armies, lose kings, and lose entire centuries in order to ultimately win something far more valuable: eternity itself. To understand the depth of this civilization, we need to rewind time far beyond the era of empires and kings, deep into the prehistoric darkness. Traditionally, the Western world considers Mesopotamia, meaning Sumer and Babylon, or ancient Egypt, to be the cradle of civilization. In this worldview, Iran is often sidelined, treated as a peripheral region that only became important once Cyrus the Great showed up in the 6th century BCE. That framing is a massive historical injustice, one that ignores decades of archaeological evidence. The Iranian plateau was home to human activity stretching back into the mists of the Paleolithic. Evolution took its natural course here across unimaginable timescales. Roughly 50,000 years ago, Neanderthals dominated these highlands, leaving behind stone tools in caves like Shanidar across the Zagros mountain range and Bisitun in western Iran. By around 36,000 years ago, anatomically modern humans, Cro-Magnons, had replaced them entirely, and their presence is documented in rock shelters scattered across the plateau. But the real revolution, the moment that separates surviving from civilizing, began much later, during the Neolithic transition. Archaeologists have discovered astonishingly early urban-type settlements on Iranian territory that rival or even predate the more famous sites of Mesopotamia. Settlements like Tepe Sialk, near the modern city of Kashan, show continuous habitation stretching back to approximately 5500 BCE, with evidence of proto-urban planning, specialized pottery workshops, and metallurgical experimentation that places Iran at the absolute cutting edge of early human innovation. Even earlier, sites like Ganj Dareh in the Zagros foothills date to roughly 7000 BCE and show some of the earliest evidence anywhere on Earth of the transition from nomadic hunting and gathering to settled agriculture and animal domestication, the very transformation that made civilization itself possible. These were not primitive camps. These were communities with mud brick architecture, storage facilities for surplus grain, and the kind of social organization that only emerges when people have decided to stay in one place and build something meant to outlast a single human lifetime. The roots of Persian civilization reach not merely deep, but deeper than most people have ever been taught to imagine.
6,000 years before anyone thought to draw a border on a map, people in the highlands of Iran were already stacking bricks into monuments that touched the sky. The Jiroft culture, buried beneath the sands of southeastern Iran until archaeologists stumbled upon it in the early 2000s, rewrote the timeline of civilization itself. The Sialk ziggurat, rising from the dusty plains near modern Kashan, dates back 6,000 to 7,000 years, older than the Great Pyramid of Giza by millennia, older than Stonehenge by at least 2,000 years. And then there are the ceramic vessels. Pulled from graves and ruined workshops across the Iranian plateau, these delicate objects from the 4th millennium before Christ, painted with geometric precision, glazed with techniques that still puzzle modern potters, prove something irrefutable. One of the oldest civilizations on this planet did not merely flicker to life here. It evolved, it flourished, it stood shoulder to shoulder with Mesopotamia and China as a pillar of human progress. And while those two civilizations have long dominated school books and museum wings, this third pillar, Iran, has been quietly waiting for the world to catch up. The first major geopolitical power to emerge from these ancient lands was Elam, a state rooted in the southwest of modern Iran, with its glittering capital at Susa. Picture Susa in its prime, a city of towering mud brick walls and painted temples, positioned at the crossroads of trade routes that stretched from the Persian Gulf to the mountains of the Zagros Range. The Elamites were not a minor footnote in ancient history. They were a force so formidable that by the 26th century before Christ, they were practically dictating terms to the Sumerians, the very people credited with inventing writing. Sumerian tablets from that era reference Elamite raids, Elamite demands, Elamite kings who refused to kneel. Susa itself became one of the wealthiest cities in the ancient world, its markets flooded with lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, copper from Oman, textiles dyed in colors that traders from Ur could only dream of producing. But the most extraordinary event in Elam's early story unfolded in the 23rd century before Christ, when the Akkadian king Naram-Sin, grandson of Sargon the Great, the man who had forged the world's first empire, marched his armies eastward to confront the Elamites. This was no ordinary border skirmish. Naram-Sin commanded a military machine that had already crushed dozens of city-states from the Mediterranean coast to the Zagros foothills. He fully expected Elam to submit.
But the Elamites fought back with a ferocity that shocked the Akkadian court. The conflict ground on, bleeding both sides, until something unprecedented happened. Instead of one king simply enslaving the other, instead of the usual cycle of massacre and tribute, the two powers sat down and negotiated. A written treaty was drafted, pressed into clay, sealed with royal insignia. The treaty guaranteed Elam's independence, its sovereignty recognized in black and white, on the single condition that Elam would align its foreign policy with Akkad. Pause on that for a moment. This is the first documented international treaty in human history. Not a surrender document, not a list of plunder, a negotiated agreement between two sovereign states, complete with terms, conditions, and mutual obligations. The Iranian plateau stood at the very origins of global diplomacy, and that clay tablet was the seed from which every alliance, every trade deal, every United Nations resolution would eventually grow. Genetically, however, the Elamites were closer to the peoples of Mesopotamia than to the populations that would later define Iran. The people we call Iranians today, the ones whose language, poetry, and culture would reshape the entire Middle East, arrived later. Sometime between the 20th and 15th centuries before Christ, nomadic tribes began descending onto this mountainous plateau from the north, pouring down from the vast steppes of Central Asia and the rugged passes of the Caucasus. They traveled with their herds, their families, their oral traditions, and their weapons. They belonged to the enormous family of Indo-European nations, representing its distinct Indo-Iranian branch, a linguistic and cultural lineage that stretches like a great tree across continents. Their ancient language, a tongue spoken around campfires on the open steppe, was a direct relative of Latin, Greek, and the languages spoken across all of Europe today. English and Spanish, German and French, Russian and Hindi, all of them cousins, all of them tracing their roots back to the same ancestral speech that these migrating tribes carried with them into the Iranian highlands. It is one of the great ironies of history. An American speaking English in New York and a shepherd speaking Farsi in the Zagros Mountains are using languages that sprang from the same source, separated by thousands of years and thousands of miles, yet still bearing the family resemblance in their grammar, their numbers, their most basic words for mother, father, water, fire. Settling on these new lands, the migrants began calling themselves Aryans, a word meaning noble or of good lineage, and they named their new homeland Aryanum Vaesia, the land of the Aryans. Say it aloud a few times. Aryanum, Iran. The transformation is almost audible. Over centuries, the word compressed and softened, shedding syllables like a river smoothing stone, until it became the name the country carries to this day. These newcomers did not simply conquer the existing Elamite civilization, they merged with it. They absorbed Elamite administrative techniques, Elamite art motifs, Elamite religious symbols. In return, they brought their horses, their metalworking skills, and their fierce tribal loyalties. Out of this fusion, powerful alliances crystallized.
The most famous were the Medes, who settled in the northwest around modern Hamadan, and the Persians, who migrated south into the region of Fars, the very province whose name would eventually become synonymous with the entire nation. But it was not military hardware that truly set the ancient Iranians apart from every other civilization of their era. It was not the war chariot, though they mastered it. It was not the composite bow, though their archers were legendary. The primary weapon of the Iranians, the tool that would project their influence across continents and across millennia, was ideology. Long before the emergence of Christianity, long before the Prophet Muhammad received his first revelation, long before the Buddha sat beneath the Bodhi tree, a religion was born on the Iranian plateau that turned human consciousness completely upside down: Zoroastrianism.
founded by the prophet Zarathustra, a figure so ancient that scholars still argue whether he lived in 1500 or 1000 before Christ. This faith introduced ideas so radical that they feel almost modern. For the ancient Iranian who embraced Zarathustra's teachings, life was not simply a series of meaningless accidents. It was not a cyclical loop of seasons and harvests with no greater purpose. It was not the plaything of capricious gods who tormented humans for entertainment, as the Mesopotamians often believed. Instead, Zoroastrianism presented existence as a cosmic battlefield, a grand moral drama in which every single human being had a role to play, a choice to make, a side to join. Light against darkness, truth against falsehood. Ahura Mazda, the Lord of Wisdom, stood on one side. Angra Mainyu, the destructive spirit, stood on the other. And between them stood humanity, gifted with free will, burdened with responsibility, and destined to tip the balance. Fire against darkness, truth against the lie. No civilization before Iran had ever drawn the battle lines of existence with such terrifying clarity. Zoroastrianism didn't merely offer its followers a theology, it handed them a cosmic war map, complete with enemy territory, allied forces, and a ticking clock counting down to the final confrontation. At the summit of reality stood Ahura Mazda, the transcendent god of light, truth, and righteous order, a deity who didn't demand cowering submission, but instead invited every human being to become an active soldier in the struggle for good. Opposing him was Angra Mainyu, known also as Ahriman, the spirit of absolute evil, deception, and annihilating darkness. Between these two poles, every thought, every word, every deed either strengthened the light or fed the shadow. There was no neutral ground, there were no bystanders. And here is what made Zoroastrianism so explosively powerful as a cultural engine. It didn't leave evil as some abstract philosophical concept, it mapped evil onto geography.
The realm of darkness was identified with the vast nomadic expanses of Inner Asia, the Turan of Iranian mythology, that boundless steppe from which devastating raids had been launched against settled Iranian communities for centuries. Every horseback raider who burned a village, slaughtered cattle, or carried off women and children was not merely a military threat. He was an agent of cosmic falsehood. To be Iranian, to be Arya in the deepest sense of the word, meant to be a warrior of light. Their poetry celebrated it, their priests chanted it, their kings inscribed it on cliff faces. The entire edifice of Iranian statehood, from the smallest village headman judging a dispute to the emperor sitting on a golden throne, was constructed on this single burning idea. We exist to actively assist the forces of good in their war against the lie. This wasn't passive piety, this was militarized metaphysics. And it gave the Iranian peoples a degree of cultural unity and collective purpose that their neighbors, fractured into competing city-states or tribal federations, simply could not match. But Zoroastrianism accomplished something even more massive, something that would reshape the mental architecture of the entire human species. For millennia, virtually every civilization on Earth understood time as a wheel. The Egyptians watched the Nile flood and recede in eternal cycles. The Mesopotamians recorded king lists that seemed to loop back on themselves. The Vedic Indians spoke of yugas, vast cosmic ages repeating without end, creation and destruction breathing in and out like a sleeping giant. Zoroastrianism shattered the wheel. For the first time in recorded religious history, a tradition declared with absolute conviction, time is not a circle, time is a line. It has a definite beginning,
the moment of creation when Ahura Mazda brought the world into being. It has a middle, the present age of mixture, when good and evil are tangled together in every human heart and every grain of soil. And it has an inevitable, non-negotiable end, Frascio Cereti, the final renovation, a last apocalyptic battle between the forces of light and the forces of darkness, a purification of the entire world by rivers of molten metal, a resurrection of the dead, a last judgment in which every soul would be weighed, and then, and this is breathtaking in its optimism, a renewed, perfected world where evil would be annihilated forever and every being would exist in eternal joy. Think about what this means. Before Zoroaster, people looked at history and saw repetition. After Zoroaster, people looked at history and saw a story, a narrative with a beginning, a climax, and a resolution. Progress became thinkable. Hope became rational. The future became something fundamentally different from the past, not just the same drama performed on a rotating stage. How did this revolutionary idea conquer the world?
The answer lies in one of history's great geopolitical collisions. When the Persians under Cyrus the Great conquered Babylon in 539 before Christ, they found there a community of Jewish exiles who had been languishing in captivity since Nebuchadnezzar had destroyed Jerusalem and its temple decades earlier. Cyrus liberated them, famously, generously, in an act so stunning that the Hebrew Bible calls him a Messiah, an anointed one of God, the only non-Jew ever to receive that title in Scripture. But liberation did not mean separation. Judea became a province of the Persian Empire, and it would remain under Persian political and cultural influence for roughly 2 centuries. During this prolonged period of intimate contact, Jewish thinkers absorbed from their Zoroastrian overlords a constellation of ideas that had been absent or only faintly sketched in earlier Israelite religion. The expectation of a final apocalyptic end of days, the resurrection of the dead, a last judgment with rewards and punishments, angels and demons organized into hierarchies, a supreme adversary, Satan, who functioned remarkably like Angra Mainyu, linear time marching toward a cosmic climax. Before the Babylonian exile, ancient Israelite religion focused overwhelmingly on this world, on covenant, on land, on law. After the Persian period, Judaism began developing the apocalyptic traditions that would eventually flow directly into Christianity and Islam. The Book of Daniel, with its visions of world empires and final divine intervention, was written under heavy Persian influence. The Pharisees, who championed resurrection of the dead, emerged in a theological landscape already saturated with Zoroastrian concepts. And when Christianity carried these ideas across the Roman Empire and Islam carried them across Arabia, North Africa, and Central Asia, the Zoroastrian framework of linear time, final judgment, and cosmic battle became the default operating system of Western and Middle Eastern civilization. Prominent thinkers, including the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, who understood the stakes better than most, acknowledged openly that Iran played the key role in discovering linear time, the very coordinates within which billions of people still think today. Every time someone says the end of the world, every time a preacher warns of Judgment Day, every time a filmmaker imagines the apocalypse, they are drawing on a tradition that traces back to an Iranian prophet standing on the Central Asian steppe 3,000 years ago. The first truly great state built by these Aryan peoples was Media, forged around 670 before Christ in the mountainous terrain of western Iran. The Medes were fierce, organized, and ambitious. Their kingdom did not last long in historical terms, perhaps a century of genuine power, but in that compressed span, they accomplished something that stunned the ancient world.
They became the primary force behind the destruction of the Assyrian Empire, that terrifying military machine that had dominated the Near East for 300 years. A regime so brutal that its own inscriptions boasted of flaying captives alive and stacking pyramids of severed heads outside conquered cities. The Medes, allied with the Babylonians, stormed the Assyrian heartland, sacked the great city of Nineveh in 612 before Christ, and erased Assyria from the map so thoroughly that within a few generations the very location of its capital would be forgotten beneath the dust. Median hegemony over Iran and much of the Near East seemed secure. But history had other plans, and the agents of change were the Medes' own relatives. In 550 before Christ, a man named Cyrus, half Persian through his father, half Median through his mother, rose in revolt against his Median grandfather, King Astyages. The details of the conflict are murky, laced with legend, but the result was decisive. Cyrus united the two kindred peoples, the Highland Persians and the Medes, into a single political entity, and from this union he began constructing what historians would eventually call the Achaemenid Empire, the first authentic superpower in human history. Within a single generation, Cyrus conquered Lydia in western Anatolia, seizing its legendary king Croesus and his fabled gold. He absorbed the Greek city-states dotting the coast of Asia Minor, and then he marched on Babylon, the greatest city in the world, taking it in 539 with so little bloodshed that later generations could scarcely believe it. Cyrus was different from every conqueror who had come before. He did not raise temples, he did not enslave populations, he did not impose his gods on the defeated. Instead, he restored local cults, returned stolen religious statues to their rightful sanctuaries, and issued a decree, preserved on the famous Cyrus cylinder, proclaiming respect for the traditions and freedoms of his subjects. He built an empire not on terror, but on a calculated, visionary tolerance that made subject peoples prefer Persian rule to independence. His successor, Darius I, expanded the borders even further, pushing east to the Indus Valley, west to the shores of the Aegean, south into Egypt and Libya, creating a dominion that stretched across 3 continents and encompassed perhaps 40% of the world's population at the time. Blood doesn't lie, and neither does a severed head floating in a leather sack. That single image, the skull of the greatest conqueror the ancient world had ever known, bobbing in a wineskin brimming with human blood, tells you everything about what Persia was and what it cost to rule it. Cyrus the Great had swallowed kingdoms the way a python swallows prey. Media, Lydia, Babylon, one after another, each digested into the expanding body of the Achaemenid Empire.
By the time his successors finished the work he started, nearly 50 million people lived under Persian authority. To put that number in perspective, that was roughly half the entire population of the planet at the time. 1 out of every 2 human beings alive on Earth answered, directly or indirectly, to the King of Kings in Persepolis. No empire before it had ever achieved anything remotely close to that scale. The administrative machinery required to hold such a colossus together was staggering, and the Persians invented most of it from scratch. Darius the Great, who ascended to the throne in 522 before Christ after a bloody succession crisis, proved to be one of history's supreme organizers. He carved the empire into 20 satrapies, administrative provinces, each governed by a satrap who functioned as a kind of regional viceroy. Every satrap collected taxes, maintained order, and raised troops when the king demanded them. But Darius was no fool. He understood that giving a man too much local power was an invitation to rebellion.
So he installed a parallel system of royal inspectors, the so-called eyes and ears of the king, who traveled unannounced from province to province, auditing the satraps, checking their loyalty, reporting back to the throne. It was an ancient version of an internal affairs bureau, and it worked brilliantly for generations. Then came the money. Darius introduced a standardized gold coin called the daric, weighing about 8.4 grams of high-purity gold. For the first time in history, a merchant in Egypt could conduct business with a trader in Bactria using the same trusted currency. The daric became the dollar of the ancient world, accepted everywhere, counterfeited nowhere, because the penalties were savage. Alongside the currency came a unified system of weights and measures, which slashed transaction costs across thousands of miles of trade routes. And those trade routes themselves were another marvel. The Royal Road stretched roughly 2,700 kilometers from Sardis in western Anatolia to Susa in the Persian heartland. Mounted couriers stationed at relay posts spaced a day's ride apart could carry a royal message the entire length of the road in about 7 days, a speed that would not be matched in that part of the world for over 2,000 years. Herodotus, who was not easily impressed, wrote of these riders, "Neither snow nor rain nor heat nor gloom of night stays these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds." That line, incidentally, ended up inscribed on the New York City General Post Office building millennia later. The United States Postal Service unknowingly borrowed its unofficial motto from the Persian Empire. But history does not forgive weakness, and even the greatest empire begins its story of decline with a single miscalculation.
Cyrus, still hungry for conquest in his 60s, turned his attention to the northeastern frontier, where the Massagetai, a confederation of fierce nomadic tribes, roamed the steppes of Central Asia. These were not soft city dwellers waiting to be absorbed. They were horse warriors, raised in the saddle, hardened by wind and war, and led by a queen named Tamiris, whose reputation for ferocity was no exaggeration. Cyrus reportedly tried cunning first, setting out a lavish feast with strong wine in an abandoned camp, hoping the nomads would drink themselves into a stupor. The trick worked partially. Tamiris' son, Spargapeses, fell into the trap, was captured, and in his shame took his own life. That was the last mistake Cyrus ever made. Tamiris, burning with grief and fury, gathered her full horde and fell on the Persian army with a violence that ancient sources describe as the bloodiest battle the world had yet seen. The Persian force was annihilated. Cyrus himself was killed on the field. Tamiris ordered his body found, and when her warriors dragged the corpse before her, she severed the head of the King of Kings and plunged it into a leather sack filled to the brim with human blood. "You thirsted for blood your whole life," she reportedly said, her voice flat with contempt. "Now drink your fill." It was a death worthy of a Shakespearean tragedy. The man who had freed nations and built the largest empire in history, reduced to a trophy in a bag of gore. Yet the empire did not die with its founder. That is the astonishing part. Cyrus's son Cambyses added Egypt to the realm. Darius consolidated, organized, and expanded further. The Achaemenid machine was so well built that it could survive the loss of even its creator. And it survived something else that Western culture has inflated into a civilization-defining epic, the Greco-Persian Wars. We have all heard the story: 300 Spartans at Thermopylae, the Athenian triremes at Salamis, the final Greek victory at Plataea. Hollywood turned it into a franchise. School textbooks present it as the moment Western civilization was saved from Eastern despotism. But strip away the mythology and look at the numbers. the Greek city-states collectively controlled perhaps a few million people along a rocky, resource-poor peninsula. The Achaemenid Empire governed 50 million across 3 continents. Losing a campaign in Greece was, for the Persians, roughly equivalent to a modern superpower failing to pacify a small rebellious province. Irritating, certainly. Embarrassing, perhaps. Existential? Not even close. The Persians simply adapted. When direct military conquest proved too costly against Greek terrain and Greek stubbornness, they switched to a far more effective weapon: gold. Persian diplomats and agents began pouring darics into Greek politics, funding first Athens against Sparta, then Sparta against Athens, then Thebes against both.
The Greeks, who could never stop fighting each other for more than a few years at a time, took the bait every single time. The catastrophic Peloponnesian War, which shattered Athenian power and left all of Greece exhausted, was partially financed by Persian money. By 387 before Christ, the situation had become almost comical. The Greek city-states, broken and bankrupt after decades of fratricidal warfare, were forced to accept the so-called King's Peace, a treaty dictated by the Persian king Artaxerxes II. Under its terms, the Greek cities of Asia Minor were formally recognized as Persian territory, and the Greeks agreed to stop fighting each other, essentially under Persian supervision. What the great king could not seize with 1 million soldiers at Marathon and Thermopylae, he purchased with bags of gold coins and a few well-placed bribes. Persia became the undisputed arbiter of Greek affairs without firing a single arrow. It was one of the most elegant strategic victories in ancient history, and almost nobody in the West talks about it. The real catastrophe, when it came, arrived not from the West, but from within. The Achaemenid Empire had grown so vast, so ethnically diverse, so administratively complex, that even the brilliant satrapy system began to crack under its own weight. Provincial revolts flared. Satraps, who were supposed to be loyal governors, started behaving like independent kings. Court intrigues in Persepolis consumed the energy that should have gone to military reform. And into this moment of internal fracture rode a 25-year-old Macedonian king with an army of 40,000 and an ego the size of the known world. Alexander of Macedon crossed into Asia in 334 before Christ, and within 4 years he had dismantled the Achaemenid Empire entirely. His Macedonian phalanx, disciplined, innovative, armed with 6-meter sarissa pikes, methodically crushed every Persian army thrown against it, at Granicus, at Issus, and finally at Gaugamela in 331 before Christ, where Darius III fled the field and the empire effectively ceased to exist. Alexander marched into Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of Achaemenid power, and in a single drunken night, or perhaps a calculated act of propaganda, he burned the magnificent palace complex to the ground. Columns that had taken decades to carve collapsed in hours. Cedar ceilings, imported from Lebanon, turned to ash. The reliefs, showing tribute bearers from 20 nations, melted in the heat. It seemed like the end. 1,000 years of Iranian civilization reduced to charcoal and memory. But Persia had a survival mechanism that no conqueror ever managed to defeat: cultural absorption. From the ruins of the Achaemenids rose the Hellenistic Seleucid state, ruled by Alexander's Greek-speaking successors. And this is precisely when something extraordinary began to happen. Instead of the conquered Persians becoming Greek, the conquering Greeks began becoming Persian. Alexander himself had started the process before he even died.
He adopted Persian royal dress, insisted on the Persian court ritual of proskynesis, bowing before the king,
married the Bactrian princess Roxana, and encouraged his officers to take Persian wives. His own men were horrified. They had marched thousands of miles to conquer barbarians, and now their king was turning into one. A bleeding giant staggering under the weight of 400 years of non-stop war. That is the image you need to hold in your mind to understand what happened next to Iran. Because the story of Persia after Alexander is not a story of decline. It is a story of a civilization so deeply rooted that it swallowed every conqueror whole, digested their armies, absorbed their gods, and came out the other side speaking the same language, dreaming the same dreams, worshipping the same fire. When Alexander's generals carved up his empire like a slaughtered ox, the eastern provinces fell to Seleucus, one of the most ambitious of the Diadochi. The Seleucid Empire stretched from the Mediterranean coast all the way to the borders of India, and on paper it looked like Greece had permanently replaced Persia as the ruling civilization of the East. Greek became the language of administration. Greek temples rose beside ancient Iranian fire altars. Greek philosophy circulated in the bazaars of Babylon. Court etiquette was rewritten along Hellenistic lines, and Persian nobles were expected to dress, speak, and think like Athenians. But here is the thing about imposing a foreign culture on a people who have been building civilizations for 3,000 years. It does not stick. The policy of Hellenization choked on the thick, ancient Iranian worldview the way a river chokes on a boulder. The boulder does not move. The river eventually finds a way around it, but the boulder remains exactly where it has always been. In the 3rd century before Christ, the Parthians, an Indo-Iranian tribe from the northeastern steppes, rose up and kicked the Greeks out. They did not just rebel, they built an empire. The Parthian Empire, also known as the Arsacid Empire, eventually controlled a territory stretching from the Euphrates River to eastern Iran, encompassing modern-day Iraq, Iran, Armenia, and parts of Turkey and Pakistan. Their ruler, Mithridates I, proclaimed himself Shahanshah, King of Kings, and declared himself the rightful successor to the Achaemenids. This was not empty posturing. It was a deliberate political statement, a message broadcast across the ancient world. Persia is back. For 5 centuries, the Parthians held the line against the most powerful military machine the Western world had ever produced, the Roman Empire. And they did not just hold the line, they shattered it repeatedly.
Their secret weapon was a combination of heavily armored cataphracts, mounted knights clad head to toe in scale armor, riding horses equally armored, and light horse archers capable of a maneuver so devastating it entered the vocabulary of every language on earth: the Parthian shot. Picture this. A Parthian horseman gallops away from a pursuing Roman legionary, and just as the Roman thinks the enemy is fleeing, the rider twists in his saddle and fires an arrow backward with lethal precision. The Romans learned this lesson the hard way at the Battle of Carrhae in 53 BC, where the Parthian general Surena annihilated 7 Roman legions, roughly 35,000 soldiers, led by Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of the richest and most powerful men in Rome. Crassus himself was killed. According to legend, the Parthians poured molten gold down his throat as a mocking tribute to his legendary greed. It was one of the worst military defeats in Roman history, and it established the Euphrates River as a boundary that Rome would struggle to cross for centuries. Then, in the year 224 AD, a new golden age arrived. A Persian nobleman named Ardashir from the province of Fars, the very same region where Cyrus the Great had once raised his first army, overthrew the last Parthian king and founded the Sassanid dynasty.
This was not a foreign conquest. This was Persia reclaiming itself from within. The Sassanids saw themselves as the direct heirs of the Achaemenids, separated by 5 centuries of Hellenistic and Parthian rule, and they set about building a state that would have made Darius the Great proud. The Sassanid Empire was a fiercely centralized superpower. Zoroastrianism was elevated from a widely practiced faith to the official state doctrine, enforced and administered by a powerful priestly caste called the Magi. Society was divided into strict hereditary classes: priests, warriors, bureaucrats, and commoners. But here is what made the Sassanid system remarkable. Despite the rigid class structure, advancement was possible through merit. A talented scribe from a common family could rise to become a provincial governor. A gifted soldier could earn a title and land. It was not a perfect meritocracy by modern standards, but by the standards of the ancient world, it was revolutionary. The Sassanids also invested massively in infrastructure, building roads, bridges, irrigation canals, and entire planned cities. Their capital at Ctesiphon, near modern Baghdad, featured the Tak Kasra, a massive vaulted hall with the largest single-span, unreinforced brick arch ever constructed, soaring more than 37 meters high. Visitors from Rome and Constantinople who saw it reportedly stood in stunned silence. It still partially stands today, 1,700 years later, a stubborn monument to Sassanid engineering.
For almost 400 years, the Sassanids waged crueling, titanic wars, first against the Roman Empire, then against its eastern successor, the Byzantine Empire, for control of Mesopotamia, Armenia, and the Caucasus. These were not minor border skirmishes. These were full-scale campaigns involving hundreds of thousands of soldiers, sieges lasting years, and battles that reshaped the political map of the entire Near East. In 260 AD, the Sassanid king Shapur I achieved something no other ruler in history had accomplished. He captured a sitting Roman emperor, Valerian, on the battlefield at the Battle of Edessa. Shapur reportedly used Valerian as a human footstool when mounting his horse, and after the emperor's death, his skin was stuffed and displayed in a Zoroastrian temple as a trophy. Rock reliefs at Naksh-e-Rostam still show Shapur on horseback, towering over the kneeling Roman emperor, a scene carved into the living rock of Iran's mountains so that no one would ever forget. But centuries of endless warfare bled Iran dry. By the mid-7th century, the Sassanid Empire was a bleeding giant, exhausted from a catastrophic final war with Byzantium that had lasted 26 years and left both empires shattered. The treasury was empty, the army was decimated, provincial governors squabbled over the throne, and then a new, unprecedented force came screaming out of the deserts of the Arabian Peninsula, the Arab Caliphate. Fueled by the revolutionary energy of a brand new faith, Islam, Arab armies swept through the Middle East with a speed that stunned the ancient world. In 636, at the Battle of Al-Qadisiyah, a relatively small Arab force crushed the main Sassanid army. By 651, the Persian capital had fallen, and the last Shahanshah of the Sassanid dynasty, Yazdegerd III, was treacherously murdered by a miller in the remote eastern city of Merv, stabbed to death for the few coins in his pocket. A dynasty that had ruled for 4 centuries ended in a dusty back room, unwitnessed and unmourned by the world. All of Iran fell under Arab rule. The era of the Umayyad Caliphate began. The Arabs brought a new religion, Islam, and a new administrative language, Arabic.
Zoroastrianism, which had fueled the Iranian spirit for over 1,000 years, began to fade under social and economic pressure. Zoroastrians faced higher taxes, restricted rights, and the steady erosion of their temples and traditions. For any other culture, this would have meant total erasure, exactly as it happened with Egypt, where the ancient Egyptian language, religion, and identity were replaced entirely by Arabic and Islam, or Syria, which became permanently Arabized within a few generations. But the Persians did it again. They bent without breaking. Various Arab rulers tried to force the Persians to abandon their roots completely.
The Umayyad caliphs, in particular, treated non-Arab Muslims as second-class citizens, imposing discriminatory taxes and barring Persians from high office. Yet, having suffered total military defeat, the Iranians struck back on the one battlefield where they could not be beaten: culture. When the Abbasid revolution overthrew the Umayyads in 750 AD, a revolution crucially powered in large part by Persian converts to Islam, the new Abbasid Caliphate began to rely heavily on Persian bureaucrats, scholars, physicians, and poets. Arab caliphs adopted Persian methods of governance wholesale. The position of vizier, the chief minister who actually ran the empire's day-to-day affairs, was a Persian invention borrowed directly from the Sassanid court. Persian scientists translated Greek, Indian, and Sassanid texts into Arabic, creating the intellectual foundation of the Islamic Golden Age. The Farsi language did not just survive, it thrived, outliving dozens of empires. The greatest scientific treatises, the most celebrated poems, the most influential works of philosophy in the medieval Islamic world continued to be written in Persian. Firdausi's Shahnameh, completed around the year 1010, deliberately purged Arabic loanwords from the language and retold the mythic history of Iran in pure Farsi, a cultural act of resistance disguised as literature. And then, after the Arabs, a true apocalypse crashed down upon Iran, something so catastrophic that it nearly succeeded where every previous conqueror had failed. The year 1220 tore across the Iranian plateau like a blade dragged through living flesh. Genghis Khan and his Mongol hordes poured out of the Central Asian steppes with a singular, terrifying efficiency that the world had never witnessed. This was not ordinary conquest. This was annihilation on an industrial scale, centuries before industry even existed. The Mongols did not merely defeat armies and replace rulers. They systematically slaughtered entire cities, men, women, children, even cats and dogs, leaving nothing but silence and ash where thriving communities had stood for 1,000 years. In the city of Merv alone, historical accounts suggest that over 1 million people were put to the sword in a single devastating assault. The ancient irrigation canals, those qanat systems that had taken generations of engineers and laborers centuries to construct, were deliberately destroyed, turning fertile agricultural land into barren desert almost overnight. Entire regions that had fed millions became wastelands. It seemed to anyone watching that Iran was finished, that this magnificent civilization, already battered by centuries of Arab and Turkic rule, would finally dissolve into nothing more than empty pastureland for Mongol horses. But then, something happened that defies every expectation about how conquest is supposed to work. Genghis Khan's grandson, Hulagu Khan, established a Mongol state on Iranian soil called the Ilkhanate around the 1250s.
Within barely 2 generations, the transformation was staggering. These hardened warriors, men raised and felt yurts on the frozen Mongolian steppe, men who drank fermented mare's milk and worshipped the eternal blue sky, they converted to Islam. Not reluctantly, not superficially, but with genuine devotion. They adopted the Persian language as the official tongue of their court and administration. They commissioned the construction of grandiose mosques adorned with those iconic turquoise and cobalt blue tiles that we still associate with Iranian architecture today. They funded astronomers, mathematicians, and poets. Hulagu himself built the famous observatory at Marageh, where the brilliant scholar Nasir al-Din Tusi mapped the stars with instruments so precise they influenced Copernicus 2 centuries later. The conquerors who had come to erase Iran were now pouring treasure into preserving and expanding their intellectual heritage. It was as though the civilization itself possessed an immune system, not one that repelled invaders, but one that absorbed them, rewrote their cultural DNA, and made them Persian from the inside out. At the close of the 14th century, history delivered another catastrophic blow that seemed almost like a cruel echo. Tamerlane, Timur the Lame, erupted out of Central Asia with armies just as merciless as those of Genghis Khan. He carved a path of destruction across Iran that rivaled anything the Mongols had done. His signature calling card was the pyramid of severed human heads stacked methodically outside the gates of conquered cities as both trophy and warning. In Isfahan, one of Iran's most cherished cultural jewels, Tamerlane reportedly ordered the construction of towers made from 70,000 skulls after the city's residents dared to resist his tax collectors. The sheer psychological horror of these acts was designed to paralyze opposition before it could even form. And yet, and this is the part that should make you pause and reconsider everything you think you know about the relationship between power and culture, Tamerlane stood in genuine awe of Persian civilization. He personally selected the finest Iranian artisans, calligraphers, architects, and miniature painters, and transported them back to his capital, Samarkand, not as prisoners, but as honored guests. His descendants, the Timurids, became some of the most refined patrons of art in human history. The Timurid courts at Herat and Samarkand blossomed into epicenters of what historians call the Timurid Renaissance, an explosion of exquisite Persian miniature painting, poetry, architecture, and manuscript illumination that rivals anything the Italian Renaissance produced in the same era. The poet Jami, the painter Behzad, the astronomer Ulu Beg, these luminaries all flourished under Timurid patronage, and every one of them worked within the Persian cultural tradition. The butchers had become aesthetes. For nearly 300 years, from roughly 1220 to the early 1500s, Iran existed as a roiling cauldron.
Political power belonged to fearsome Mongol and Turkic warlords, men with names that still echo with the ring of steel and horses. But something almost magical kept repeating itself. Every Turkic or Mongol dynasty that seized the Iranian throne found itself completely absorbed within a couple of generations. They arrived speaking Turkic or Mongolian. Their grandchildren composed poetry in Persian. They arrived worshipping shamanic sky gods. Their grandchildren built mosques and debated Islamic jurisprudence. The Iranian cultural code operated like the most sophisticated piece of software ever written. It completely reprogrammed its conquerors without them even realizing it was happening. Then, in 1501, a remarkable figure emerged from this 300-year cauldron of tribes, dynasties, and cultural fusion. Shah Ismail,
barely 15 years old, rode out of the mountains of Azerbaijan at the head of a fanatically devoted army of Kizilbash warriors, Turkic tribesmen who wore distinctive red headgear and regarded their young leader as something close to divine. With breathtaking speed, Ismail conquered Tabriz, declared himself Shah, and founded the Safavid dynasty. But his most consequential act was not military, it was religious. Ismail declared Twelver Shia Islam the official state religion of Iran, and he enforced this conversion with absolute ruthlessness. Sunni scholars were given a choice: convert, flee, or die. This single decision permanently and irrevocably separated Iran from the rest of the predominantly Sunni Islamic world. It drew a sharp theological and cultural boundary between Iran and the mighty Ottoman Empire next door, a boundary that still defines Middle Eastern geopolitics today. Iran once again forged a rigid, unique identity, no longer just ethnically and linguistically distinct, but now religiously distinct as well. The Safavids essentially created the Iran we recognize in the modern world. By the 19th century, however, this proud civilization had entered a period of severe crisis under the Qajar dynasty, itself of Turkic origin. The Qajars presided over a nation that was falling dangerously behind the industrializing powers of Europe. Following two devastating wars with the Russian Empire, the wars of 1804 to 1813 and 1828 to 1829, Iran was forced to sign the humiliating treaties of Gulistan and Turkmenchai. These agreements permanently stripped away the territories of modern-day Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and parts of Dagestan. Centuries of Iranian influence in the Caucasus vanished with the stroke of a pen, and the psychological wound cut deep into the national consciousness. By the early 20th century, on the eve of the First World War, Iran had become the chessboard for one of history's most cynical geopolitical contests, the Great Game, the sprawling rivalry between the British and Russian empires for dominance over Central and South Asia.
In 1907, without bothering to consult anyone in Tehran, Britain and Russia simply signed an agreement dividing Iran into spheres of influence, the Russians controlling the north, the British dominating the south, and a narrow neutral strip in between that fooled absolutely nobody. British engineers pumped Iranian oil through the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, which would later become BP, extracting colossal wealth while paying Iran a pittance in royalties. Russian troops garrisoned the northern provinces as though they were extensions of the Tsar's empire. After the Russian Revolution, the Soviet Union proved no less predatory. In 1945, Soviet forces occupying northern Iran attempted to carve off two puppet states, the Azerbaijan People's Government and the Republic of Mahabad, hoping to create communist buffer zones on Iran's territory. The country was suffocating, squeezed between imperial ambitions from every direction, its sovereignty little more than a polite fiction written on maps that other nations had already decided to redraw. Reza Shah Pahlavi did not simply seize power in 1925, he detonated the old order like a controlled demolition charge, then stood in the rubble and began sketching blueprints for something Iran had never seen before. A former cavalry officer who rose through the ranks of the Persian Cossack Brigade, he had watched his country be carved up, humiliated, and patronized by the British and Russians for decades. He watched the Qajar monarchs sign away concessions like men autographing their own surrender documents, and he decided with the cold clarity of a soldier that this would stop.
His ascent came through a military coup in 1921, and by 1925 he had maneuvered parliament into deposing the last Qajar Shah and crowning him instead. The Pahlavi dynasty was born not from royal bloodlines or divine right, but from sheer force of will and a loaded rifle. From day one, Reza Shah charted a hard-line course toward industrialization and modernization that would have made Ataturk and neighboring Turkey nod in recognition. He built Iran's first national railway, the Trans-Iranian Railway, a staggering engineering feat that carved through mountains and deserts, stretching over 1,300 kilometers from the Persian Gulf to the Caspian Sea. He founded the University of Tehran in 1934, Iran's first modern institution of higher education. He reformed the legal system, established secular courts, and pushed for women's education with an urgency that scandalized the conservative clergy. Factories began appearing where only bazaars had stood. Roads were paved where only caravan trails had wound through dust. He was building a nation-state from scratch, and he intended to make sure the world noticed. Then, in 1935, he made a move that shook global diplomacy in a way no cannon shot could have. For centuries, the entire Western world had called this country Persia.
The word derived from the ancient Greek name for the region of Pars, the heartland of the Achaemenid Empire, and it had stuck in European languages for over 2,000 years. Persia. The word conjured images of flying carpets, opium dens, submissive harems, and ornate but crumbling palaces, the entire catalog of Orientalist fantasy that Europe had projected onto this land since the days of Herodotus. It was a word soaked in exoticism and, more insidiously, in condescension. To call a nation Persia in 1935 was to frame it as a museum piece, a relic of antiquity, something to admire behind glass, but never to take seriously at the negotiating table. Reza Shah declared, "Enough." He sent an official directive to every embassy, every foreign ministry, every international organization on the planet. From this day forward, the country must be referred to by its true ancient name, the very name its own people had used for themselves for millennia: Iran, the land of the Aryans. The word Iran derives from Aryanum, a term found in the oldest layers of the Avesta, the sacred Zoroastrian texts, and in the inscriptions of the Achaemenid kings themselves. Darius the Great called himself an Aryan, of Aryan lineage. This was not some 20th century invention. It was an excavation, a deliberate unearthing of identity that predated Greek civilization itself. This was not a linguistic whim or a bureaucratic reshuffling of letterhead. It was a political statement of seismic proportions. We are not an exotic colony for you to romanticize. We are not your fairy tale. We are a modern, powerful nation with roots older than your oldest memory, and you will reckon with us on our terms, using our name. The diplomatic world complied, some reluctantly, some with confusion. Newspapers adjusted their style guides, atlases were reprinted. A single decree from Tehran had rewritten the vocabulary of international relations. The history of Iran is always a history of radical pivots, of a civilization that lurches from one extreme to another with the terrifying momentum of a pendulum swung from a great height. And in the 20th century, that pendulum swung with devastating force. The country found itself trapped on the global chessboard, caught between the grinding interests of superpowers who viewed it primarily as a source of oil and a square on the map to be controlled. In 1941, Britain and the Soviet Union invaded Iran and forced Reza Shah into exile, sent him to South Africa, where he died 3 years later, a deposed king in a foreign land.
His young son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, inherited the throne at 21, and for the next 30 decades, Iran became a theater of Cold War manipulation that would have consequences rippling into the present.
In 1953, when the democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh attempted to nationalize Iran's oil industry, to take back control of the resource that foreign companies had been siphoning for half a century, the CIA and British MI6 orchestrated a coup that toppled him and reinstalled the Shah with absolute power. Operation Ajax, as the Americans called it, succeeded brilliantly in the short term and catastrophically in the long term. It taught an entire generation of Iranians that democracy, when it threatened Western interests, would be crushed. That lesson festered for 26 years. It became a wound that never healed, an infection that spread through every layer of Iranian society until, in 1979, the country exploded. The Islamic Revolution was not a single event, but a volcanic eruption that had been building pressure for decades. Millions poured into the streets: students, workers, bazaar merchants, clerics, leftists, nationalists, united by a single conviction that the Shah's regime, with its secret police, its corruption, its slavish dependence on Washington, had to go. Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, exiled for 15 years, returned to Tehran in February 1979 to crowds estimated at several million people. The monarchy fell. Iran became a theocratic republic governed by the principle of velayat-e-faqih, the guardianship of the Islamic jurist. Relations with the West were severed with the dramatic punctuation of the American embassy hostage crisis, 444 days that burned the bridge between Iran and the United States so thoroughly that the ashes still smolder more than 4 decades later. And today, we witness one of the most stunning historical paradoxes of the modern world. In the mind of contemporary humanity, 2 completely different nations exist simultaneously, occupying the same geographic coordinates, but inhabiting entirely separate emotional universes. The word Iran triggers in most people images of geopolitical tension, uranium enrichment centrifuges spinning in underground facilities, harsh economic sanctions that squeeze ordinary citizens, proxy conflicts stretching from Lebanon to Yemen, and grim news reports delivered in tones of alarm. Iran, in the modern Western imagination, is a problem to be solved, a threat to be contained, a dark square on the chessboard. Meanwhile, the word Persia, ironically the very name Reza Shah fought to abolish, has not disappeared at all. It has undergone a remarkable transformation, acquiring a romantic, almost mythical aura that floats free of modern politics entirely. Persia is associated with lost grandeur, with the refined poetry of Hafez and Rumi that fills the shelves of Western bookstores, with miniature paintings of impossible gardens, with flying carpets and fairy tale empires, with saffron and rosewater and the intoxicating geometry of mosque tiles. Persia is safe. Persia is beautiful. Persia belongs to the past and therefore cannot threaten anyone. 2 names, 1 land, and a constant, relentless struggle over exactly how it will be remembered, as a civilization of breathtaking achievement or as a rogue state, as poets or as pariahs. Over its 5,000-year history, this culture developed the ultimate mechanism for survival, a technique so refined it operates almost like a biological adaptation. When clashing with Macedons, Arabs, Turks, or Mongols, they did not disappear. They absorbed their conquerors, reshaping them to fit their own ancient mold. Alexander came to destroy and stayed to become a Persian king. The Arabs brought a new religion and found it transformed by Persian mysticism, Persian philosophy, Persian administrative genius, until the Islamic Golden Age became in many ways a Persian Golden Age, wearing Arabian robes. The Mongols arrived as destroyers and within 2 generations were building mosques and patronizing Persian poets. The Safavids took Shia Islam and forged it into an instrument of national identity so powerful it defines Iran to this day. This is not passive survival. This is cultural alchemy of the highest order, the ability to take foreign metal and transmute it into Persian gold. They stood at the origins of civilization itself and invented the framework of time in which all of humanity still lives. But perhaps their greatest battle is taking place right now, in this very moment, not on any battlefield, but in the contested territory of perception and memory. Because sometimes, hidden behind the simple name of a country, there is a quiet, invisible war. A war between who we were in the past, who we are today, and how the world chooses to see us, or refuses to. The world wants us, not the version we've rehearsed in front of the bathroom mirror, not the carefully curated highlight reel we post at golden hour with the perfect caption we rewrote 11 times. The world wants the real thing, the stumbling, uncertain, sometimes contradictory, deeply human thing. And that single truth, once it actually lands in your chest and takes root, changes everything about how you move through your days. Think about the people who have mattered most in your life, not the ones who impressed you, the ones who moved you. There's a difference, and it's enormous. The person who impressed you drove a nice car, had the right job title, said clever things at dinner parties, and maintained an Instagram grid so aesthetically consistent it looked like it was designed by an architecture firm. Fine, you admired them from a distance the way you might admire a building. Cool structure, nice lines, wouldn't want to live there. But the person who moved you, they probably did something embarrassingly simple. They told you the truth when it was easier to lie. They cried in front of you without apologizing.
They admitted they had no idea what they were doing and then asked for your help. They showed you a scar, physical or emotional, and didn't dress it up with a redemption narrative. They were just there, in front of you, unarmored. And something inside you exhaled. Something inside you said, "Oh, okay, I can be real here too." That's what visibility actually means. Not fame, not attention, not the algorithmic blessing of going viral for 48 hours before the internet moves on to the next spectacle. Visibility means being genuinely seen, your texture, your contradictions, your specific and unrepeatable way of being alive. And here's the paradox that will chase you around the room until you finally stop running from it. You cannot be seen while you're hiding. You cannot be known while you're performing. You cannot be loved for who you are if you never let who you are into the room. There was a study conducted at the University of Mannheim in Germany. Researchers asked participants to evaluate others based on 2 types of self-presentation. In one condition, people shared polished, achievement-oriented descriptions of themselves. In the other, people shared honest, vulnerable accounts that included setbacks and uncertainties. Across the board, the vulnerable presentations generated more trust, more likability, and more willingness to cooperate. The polished ones generated admiration, but also distance. People respected the shiny version. They connected with the real one. The data confirmed what poets and grandmothers have been saying for centuries. Perfection is a glass wall. It lets people see a version of you, but they can never actually touch it. Consider what happens in a room when someone drops pretense. You've experienced this. Maybe it was a work meeting where everyone was performing competence, speaking in jargon, circling the actual problem like nervous satellites. And then someone, usually the person with the least to prove or the most to lose, just said it. "I don't think this is working. I'm confused. Can we start over?" And the room shifted. Shoulders dropped. Someone laughed, not a polished laugh, a relieved one. Suddenly, the meeting became a conversation. Suddenly, people started solving the actual problem instead of performing the appearance of solving it. That moment of honesty didn't make the person who spoke up look weak. It made them the most powerful person in the room because they had the one thing everyone else was rationing: courage. The world is starving for this, not in some abstract, philosophical way, in a concrete, measurable, economically quantifiable way. The global wellness industry is worth over $4.5 trillion. Therapy apps have seen download numbers increase by 300% in the last 5 years. Books about authenticity, vulnerability, and emotional intelligence dominate bestseller lists in ways that business strategy books did 20 years ago.
People are spending real money, real time, and real energy trying to find their way back to something that should be free and natural, the experience of being themselves without apology. The market wouldn't exist if the need weren't desperate. We have built an entire economy around the problem of people not feeling permission to be real. And social media, for all its democratizing promise, has in many ways made the problem worse. The platforms were supposed to connect us. Instead, they gave us new stages to perform on, new metrics to chase, new ways to measure our worth in likes and shares and follower counts that fluctuate like a stock price tied to nothing real. The average person spends 2 hours and 27 minutes per day on social media. That's roughly 37 days per year spent in a digital environment specifically engineered to reward performance over presence, reaction over reflection, outrage over nuance. We're marinating in a system that trains us minute by minute to optimize how we appear rather than investigate who we are. But here's what's extraordinary. Even inside that system, authenticity breaks through. The posts that go truly viral, the ones that sustain engagement beyond the initial dopamine spike, are almost never the polished ones. They're the ones where someone tells a real story. A father filming himself crying after his daughter's wedding, shaky camera, bad lighting, snot on his sleeve. A woman posting a photo of her apartment the day after her divorce, half-empty rooms, moving boxes, a single coffee mug on the counter. A teenager uploading a video about their stutter, not to inspire anyone, just to say, "This is what my mornings sound like." These pieces of content outperform the produced, the filtered, the strategically optimized because they carry the one thing no algorithm can manufacture: the unmistakable frequency of a human being who has stopped pretending. The world wants to see us because the world is made of people, and people are wired for resonance. Mirror neurons, those remarkable neural structures discovered by Giacomo Rizzoletti's team in Parma in the early 1990s, fire both when we perform an action and when we watch someone else perform that action. They're the biological infrastructure of empathy, but they respond most powerfully to genuine expression. Forced smiles activate different neural pathways than real ones. The brain knows the difference even when the conscious mind doesn't. When someone is performing, we sense it. We might not be able to articulate what feels off, but something in our chest tightens, something keeps its distance. When someone is real, the mirror neurons light up like a city grid after a blackout. Connection happens at the speed of biology, faster than thought, deeper than language. So what does it look like to let yourself be seen? It doesn't look like one thing.
It's not a formula. For one person, it means speaking up in a meeting.
For another, it means posting without a filter. For another, it means telling their partner the thing they've been holding back for 6 months because they're terrified it'll change everything. For another, it means quitting the career they pursued to make their parents proud and starting the one that makes them feel alive. For another, it means simply walking into a room without sucking in their stomach. The scale doesn't matter. What matters is the direction, toward truth, toward openness, toward the willingness to be witnessed in your actual state rather than your aspirational one. And the cost of not doing this, of spending a lifetime behind the performance, is not just loneliness, though loneliness is devastating enough. The cost is that you reach the end and realize you were never actually here. You played a character so convincingly that everyone applauded, but no one knew you because you never gave them the chance. The standing ovation was for someone who doesn't exist, and the person who does exist, the one who was there all along, hiding in the wings, watching their own life from backstage, that person never got a single moment in the light. The world wants to see us, not tomorrow when we've lost the weight or gotten the promotion or figured out the answers. Now, in our current, imperfect, unfinished state. The invitation has been open this entire time. The only thing left is to walk through the door, not as the person we think they want, but as the person we actually are, and to trust, with whatever faith we can gather, that being real will always be more powerful than being perfect.